Welcome back to the X Podcast. You're listening to the voice of John Russell Moore, sitting across from Timothy.
Why have we created that as part of the intro?
Yes.
You're listening to the voice of.
Sitting across from Timothy LaVey Moore.
Whoa. Let's not do that.
Yeah.
Wait, who is he? Why do I know
Tim
that name?
LaVey?
Who is he?
Tim LaVey?
Talking about Tim LaHaye?
LaHaye?
No, not
Like,
Tim LaHaye.
You're
Who-
talking
author
about
of
Timothy
Left
McVeigh.
Behind.
Timothy. I don't
He
know.
was the bomber, dude.
Okay, so let's not
Timothy,
call you that.
let's not do that. You're
let's
saying,
not
I think
call,
that's
let's not call you
Tim
that.
McVeigh.
And
Wasn't
then-
that his name?
then
Timothy
we
McVeigh?
have-
The Oklahoma City?
Oklahoma City bomber, I
Yeah,
think, or
yeah.
something.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's not do that.
Sorry.
Okay.
Freudian slip. And then we have Zachary Brown,
Just like the band.
just like the
Every
band.
time.
In the last episode, I referred to you as Zach Toes in the Sand Brown.
Okay.
Oh, we won't finish the rest of that.
Yep. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Heard you're pretty bummed this Christmas season.
That's not true.
Is that not true?
No, I'm very excited.
I heard they're going to make a Hallmark movie about you and your family.
You said that if there could be cameras that would follow my family around, it would the script would write itself
Yes.
for the holiday season.
I was watching him last night. He feels so at home in the miserable cold. And you were just decked out, very cozy Christmas outfit, and just your beautiful children are running through. We're decorating the foyer last night.
Mm-hmm.
And, your kids, they're in that age, they're just so joyful and happy and cute and carefree, and they're swirling around their picturesque red, ponytails just swirling. And I'm watching you be like, now remember, be helpful. And I'm like, this is like the most wholesome family. There's got to be a Hallmark movie in here somewhere.
Love it.
Maybe you should come on certain times of the day.
It's not always picture perfect.
What's the phrase you made fun of me for a long time?
There's no telling.
The witching hour.
Oh, yeah. He's like, I can't talk right now. It's the witching hour. I was like, whoa. Okay.
For anyone listening, it's the hour between 5 and 6:30 p.m. Well, it's not really an hour, but it's
When all the-
90-minute when all
the kids turn into witches?
No, it's when they're just crazy.
That's what I said. The kids turn into witches.
Is that what they call the witching hour?
I think so. I don't know.
It's like they forget all reason and form.
They lose their
and
minds.
They just
Yeah.
All right. So we have argued a lot about how we're going to approach this third topic, but we'll dive in and see where it goes. So basically, this is like an unofficial part 3 of an unofficial trifecta mini-series in the podcast stream we've had going. We did one a few weeks ago on the power of language when it comes to our faith, and we talked about the danger of God language. Then we had another one last week where we talked about the power of language you use when it comes to relationships, when it comes to others. And we talked about the danger of therapy speak. And of course, the whole kind of goal in these is to think at a higher level. It's not just the power of the words you choose, but the power of the language you use. Realizing that whenever we embrace or utilize a type of language, there are hidden meanings, assumptions, layers in that. I was reading an article today talked about they talk about in certain cultures where they don't have certain colors we have. It doesn't mean those colors don't exist. Yeah. But when we use words, we're not just picking words out of the world. Our words are literally shaping the identity that we are looking at. They're shaping our view of reality. And I don't think we realize how powerful that is. And so we've talked about the power of language with God, the power of language with others. I want to talk about, however best we can, the power of language when it comes to ideas. One of the big themes of this podcast is how do we talk about big ideas and how do we elevate the way we think about them? Yeah. And I think more often than not, we don't realize that the language we choose or even passively receive impacts the way we view those ideas. Mm-hmm. I mean, it really does. I think we don't understand the hidden narratives in them. And a few weeks ago, there's this masterclass thing that I've kind of subscribed to and been paying way too much money for that I've told you all about. And he did kind of his own exercise through this. And one of the quotes I wrote down, I just think this is really good. He says, when you embrace a language, you are embracing a reality behind that language, which is perfectly fine as long as you realize you're doing it. Yeah. And so the thought process experiment he took us through was, and this is very volatile, but the Israel-Hamas war. And his whole goal in walking through it was not even to like make a statement about what was going on and all the horrific things that were going on, but to really dissect some of the language being used.
Yeah.
And to say,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
And so I think however we can approach this, I just want to have a conversation on how do we be intentional on the language we choose and on how we think through the language we're receiving when it comes to ideas. Big ideas being the ideas that really shape how we view reality. It could be religious, could be political, could be current events. But from the headlines we read every day to the political narratives that we subscribe to how we even talk about our faith, our language is reinforcing ideas and containing hidden narratives. And so I wanted to well, and what was really tough about this is we talked about we don't really want to get controversial. We've not been controversial in a while. Here's a really tough part about this.
Why do I feel like you're trying to make us controversial?
I'm not. Here's what's really hard is when I'm trying to think about relevant examples we could think of. It was almost impossible to find something that didn't have some sort of political nature. I think that's part. Maybe that just speaks to what we talked about. Everything's been politicized nowadays.
Yeah.
So my goal in bringing some of these up is there may be some of these that are political in theme, but my goal is not to get political and to make a statement either side.
Right.
It's just to try, because I think one of the powerful things about ideas is when you can put them on the table objectively without your emotional attachment, just say, let's dissect it.
Yeah. I was just going to say, I think too, and I think we can talk about current events that might be political, have political side to them without necessarily having to dive into politics and who's right, who's wrong.
Yes.
It's more about the narratives that are being created are shaping people's reality and us to be aware of it.
Yeah.
And I think a great example of even what you're referring to that I just remember that just stood out to me when you were talking about Israel Hamas. I just remember when everything first happened in Israel, October 7th, I think it was. It was October 7th? Yeah, I think it was.
Yep.
And, there was I remember with the BBC and like the BBC refused to use the word terrorist when referring to Hamas, though almost every other major network would. And they were kind of coming under fire for, their decision not to ever, they would talk about, the Palestinian group. They would talk about this. They wouldn't use the word terrorist, even though those of us sitting at this table would all probably say that the act of what they did on October 7th was an act of terrorism.
Yes.
And even so, even if the event was obvious to the whole world that it was a terrorist type of event, they refused to use the word terrorist when referring to them because they said that was their way of staying in the middle, so to speak, that their job was to report on the news, but not to basically add their own conjecture or narrative. In other words, the term, when you refer to a group or someone or people as terrorists, it's such a negative connotation that you've already kind of cast what they are. And I just remember that whole thing blowing up and people just calling them out and other networks, and there's just, kind of blew over. But that's, I think, one example that I can think of that what you're talking about. Would you agree?
No, I think that's a really good example. I actually have a fun example.
Okay,
that
let's
I'd be
go.
curious. And it's seasonal too. And so I wanna
Happy
get,
holidays.
I want to get both of you on this.
Merry Xmas.
That's it.
Wait, is it really?
No, for real.
Yeah.
So like,
people freak out, man.
I feel like this always comes up this time of year, and I see it on my social feeds and different things like that. It's the war on Christmas.
Oh, yeah.
You hear it all the time. It's like, oh, here it starts again. The war on Christmas. Merry Xmas. Of course, we're ex-church.
I tell you what,
here.
it has. You don't know how much we have wanted to leverage the X in Xmas for purely branding reasons at X Church. And yet we don't. Not because we maybe have a problem with it, but because we know how people feel about the language.
But it's interesting. Okay, so we know how people feel about it.
How do you feel about
there's
it?
strong reactions on either side of this idea. But to me, what's interesting is when people use the term "the war on Christmas," it implies a level of violence or opposition or of fighting. And I think that I'm going to extrapolate this across a bigger principle. I don't think it's not just this example with Christmas that we do this, but I think culturally, socially, we often will use military or war language that implies like fighting or violence in our language.
Yeah. So, that's definitely not one of the examples I originally thought of, but, for our intents and purposes, let's take that language, let's take that phrase.
Yeah.
And so let's do a thought experiment on it. Why are you laughing?
I'm sorry. He shared a great example, and you go, "That was definitely not what I was expecting." I just could have I know what you were trying to do, but it sounded awful. You're like, that was just a terrible example. But since you went there, okay.
We love you.
I think it was just unexpected.
What I meant.
I think it was a great example.
That's not
Though, before we move on, because I think it's a great one, I would like to know what everybody's personal opinion is about using the term Xmas at this table.
You first.
You go first.
You first.
Me first?
I'll
go first. I'll go first.
Since you just had such a terrible idea for an idea, my mind immediately goes to there is ironically a link between the name of our church and that phrase, which is X is the Greek letter for Christ.
I know.
And so
I remember being in Bible school. This was a long time ago when this came up. And this is, I think, like Bible professor humor. But we were talking about Greek, and he's over there talking about it, and he was just like, I don't know why so many people have a problem with Xmas. He's somebody who's like trained. He's like capital letter for X in the Greek. It represents Christ. It is Christmas, but you hear so much, right? The reason why I say this is because you just dropped in what is kind of a weird controversy in the church world that anybody who's not from the church world listening probably going, what's wrong with that? And
that's the only reason I said what I said.
In the church world, people will say, you're taking Christ out of Christmas.
Yeah.
Right.
But then we'll go buy all our presents and do all the gift exchange and do all the other stuff that maybe isn't necessarily related to the actual birth of Jesus. And we don't have it, we'll call it Christmas. And so we choose to call it Christmas at X Church, not Xmas at the X or any version of that, because we know it triggers another term. It triggers people.
It triggers.
And so we try to avoid triggering people for no reason at all.
Yeah.
But it would have branded really well. Anyways.
It would have.
I think
in answer to your question, Xmas is fine.
Yeah.
Whoa.
Okay. So I apologize. I was not trying to demoralize your idea, your example. But let's use that example.
Yeah.
So, because the whole point of this podcast is how can we elevate the way we think?
Yeah.
And we can't do that unless we stop taking for granted phrases we hear and actually take the moment to dissect them. So let's dissect that phrase, the war on Christmas. Because I think maybe where I would disagree with you is I actually think there are people that are not in church that do care about that phrase because that phrase has been used for a culture war.
Yeah.
It's been used for a culture war. I think there are people who maybe wouldn't even really ever go to church but would actually find a way to make themselves angry about this or to let a certain movement make them angry about it.
You're saying people that wouldn't go to church would find a reason to be angry about a church using Xmas?
No.
About the fact that there's so many Christians that care?
About what I'm saying is there are
yes.
people who wouldn't go to church but maybe would hear on a news station there is a war on Christmas.
Oh, the
and would
language.
say, yes, there is.
They would feel there's a war on Christmas? Yeah.
No. What I'm saying is there are people who don't go to church who would hear there's a war on Christmas and find themselves angry about it.
Okay.
That somebody would say that. Yeah. I agree.
Continue on with your thought experiment.
So, thought experiment.
Yes.
Let's dissect the phrase.
The war on Christmas.
The war on Christmas. First of all, what's Christmas? Well, let's just really break it down. So that phrase, the war on Christmas. What is Christmas?
In English or Spanish?
What is it?
I mean, we're celebrating the birth of Jesus.
So by saying that, we're saying there's a war
on
celebrating the birth of Jesus.
Yes.
That's okay. So that's a big accusation.
Yes.
And the fact there's a war means someone's declaring war.
Correct.
So then we have to ask, who's declaring war? Someone's declaring war on celebrating the birth of Jesus. Who?
Everyone who wants to change Christmas to Xmas. So big box retailers and marketers and let's just call it the faceless corporations of the world.
Okay, so what makes you think that there just happens to be a lot of corporate leaders of all of these big box organizations who have collectively gotten together and decided that they're going to declare war on celebrating the birth of Jesus?
I feel like you're setting me up here.
You're supposed to be playing the person
I
that
know.
has a problem with
I know.
it, and he
I know.
is asking you to think through it.
And I would say, well, because they're anti-Christianity or they're anti-Jesus.
Who's they?
The corporate leaders.
All the corporate leaders.
Yeah,
There's a lot of corporate leaders that are Christians.
Yeah, but like they're not in the inner group.
They're not. What's the inner group?
What's the intergroup?
I mean, we can play this forever. Maybe it's a bad one to start with for dissection, but I just think there's a lot of phrases, and again, without getting political, one of the reasons that I thought about this third one is we are a year out from our next big election. So we are going to be bombarded even more so with slogans, mantras, phrases. And I just think it's so important to think critically through them and to be able to dissociate your identity from an idea, to be able to think through what does it actually mean. There
is a war on Christmas.
Okay,
Sorry. Okay.
Maybe to go back to the first week, we'll pedal slowly, we'll tread softly.
Why?
The more that you dissect an idea, the more you can even make sure you understand it. Like we talked about the power of God language. Like even one of the things that we would use, like for instance, when we're walking up on platform, we would probably never say, "Hey, 30 people got saved today," because that contains a lot of hidden meaning and assumption with us. And a whole lot of hidden meaning and assumption of the people listening. So we would probably say something different of like, hey, there's a lot of people today that decided to follow Jesus, give their lives to Jesus, and it changed their whole life. And just taking that moment to say, okay, what does that language mean? Deepens our meaning and then communicates clearly to the other person. Here's what I'm actually trying to say. One of the phrases that came to my mind that I feel like is tossed around a lot is, vote your faith. But that's a phrase that contains a lot of assumption and contains a lot of narrative and it contains this hidden meaning of, well, that means you better vote this way or vote that way, or that everything in your faith journey needs to be legalized, or that everything. And so for me, it's just I'm just trying to think through like or even so when we went through the thought exercise of Israel and Hamas. A couple of the words that, we took time as a group to like break down is like, again, it's a tragic situation. This isn't commentary on what's going on. We've already had podcasts about the tragedy over there, the terrorist attack on Israel, also the empathy for the humanitarian plight that the Palestinians are facing, all of that stuff. But there's words being thrown around that have not been thought through and are just being used carelessly. Words like occupiers, occupied land. And then regardless of how you feel about it, like that contains a lot of assumption. That contains a lot of meaning of determining, okay, how far back in history you're going. Like when you say that, you're automatically saying that this group of people is illegally trespassing on this group. You're creating an entire novel of meaning by one assumed word. And so I guess the whole point of this is like, how do we think through? And maybe this is a weird analogy that came to my mind. I was doing this stairs last night, trying to run off some of my Thanksgiving calories, and I had this weird mental picture come to my mind of, I think a lot of times when we're trying to create language to communicate an idea, we're trying to use the most persuasive language possible, which can be a great thing. I actually think there's power in persuasion. I think, even in Scripture from a faith context, Peter and Paul talk about the power to persuade, like we want to persuade people. As a communicator, I want to use my words to persuade people. I've been told since I was a kid, sometimes in complimentary ways, sometimes in not. Like, Russ, you have the power of persuasion. My mom used to say, Russ, you should be a lawyer. And I think using that in the right way is powerful. I want to persuade people to love God. I want to persuade people to love Jesus. I want to persuade people to live at their highest level. But I think if you take an idea that you want to persuade people on, but you camouflage the side that you want to hide, and you invalidate what the other side is, what you've done is you've built an island of defense to defend anybody that disagrees with you and to make them feel stupid and immoral. And so the image that came to my mind is when I'm persuading people, I can either become an island or I can use my language to be a bridge. And I'll give you an example of what I mean by this. In the world of, pro-life, pro-choice. I know, again, it's so dangerous to talk about these things, but let's, on the pro-choice side, there's a phrase that the only thing that we're talking about here is the reproductive health of women. Mm-hmm. What that does, whether you agree with that or not, what that does is it creates a narrative that completely eliminates a whole aspect that everybody on any side obviously knows is central to the issue, which is also the baby. But when that argument is made, what's made is you're saying it and phrasing it in a way to where you are making yourself an island and anybody that disagrees with you is stupid or immoral. And I think the thought process I've been going through is how do you communicate in a way where you're passionate about what you believe, but you are also honest and you create a bridge of understanding with the other side. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
No, that's good.
Was that provoking you?
Well, I think one of the things I'm kind of imagining, and my mind is just cycling through so many different thoughts that we experience every day, which is the news headlines to everything. I think being cognizant of, number one, how I think what you're talking about is like weighted language or using language to communicate. And I think one of the things that's been difficult for us as a society for probably the last, I don't know, people would say the last decade, maybe 2 decades it's been going on, is that it seems like in the world of, let's just say, journalism, for example, that there seems to be no middle anymore.
Correct.
That it seems to be that every journalistic organization seems to have an agenda, whether it's a right-leaning, left-leaning, and so because of that, so these are those kind of hidden motives or assumptions, is that headlines and articles are written from one perspective, but not including another perspective.
Yeah.
And I think this is one of the challenges that we are. You add to that social media. Social media is just going to continue with the algorithms to feed you the one perspective that you agree with the most. And I think this is one of the things that is really creating a big divide. And I think we just have to, number one, we've talked about this, echo chambers, all these things. I think we have to just recognize that exists. And I think we have to just be careful that we don't end up living in one small slice of our world, that it's the small little echo chamber that we can never have a conversation about the ideas that are on the table. And I think as a country, right now, as you said, it's a political year coming up. There's a new presidential election. That's what it's going to be. We are going to see this in the forefront of what are the big ideas right now that are probably being debated the most? The economy. Inflation and what's happening there, war that's happening abroad, whether it's in Russia, Ukraine, or in the Middle East, the border issue coming in there, to, as we said, from abortion, reproductive rights, and should this be, the conversation is, should there be a federal, every
should it be,
every Republican,
should the rights be in the Constitution?
Yeah, every Republican primary debate that I've seen, that question has been posed to all of the candidates is, should there be a federal level ban or federal level, or should this just be in the states? What's happened with Roe v. Wade getting overturned in June of last year. So I think what the problem is, I think first we need to recognize it is intentional by a lot of news organizations and people to use very slanted, weighted language. I think we just have to understand that that is the reality we live in. Everybody wants to persuade everyone else to think like them.
Yep.
And so understanding that, I think what we're asking at this conversation is, how can we, number one, recognize our internal biases based on our chambers and our things, and then two, how can we engage in a very productive conversation with other people? Because I think the only way we get to real solutions in our country is we get rid of the language with assumption that's built in, and we have just a really honest conversation about just the bare bones idea.
Yeah.
And I think one of the first ways that comes to my mind for us to start doing that is trying to figure out how we can remove the identity portion of these conversations.
Yeah.
Because we have so isolated ourselves of, I'm a this, and if you're a that, whatever, Republican, Democrat, pick your side, whatever, you're on the other side. And it's almost a defensive position. And what we don't even see, and part of the problem is, when I say at the top, I don't mean just the president, I mean all of Washington. We have seen played out over and over more in the last, I'd say, 10, 20 years I've ever been alive, of a refusal to push away from the extremes and the sides to say, let's sit down and come up with a solution that is going to be the best solution for the most good in our nation.
Yeah.
We are not getting that at all.
Yep.
Like in Congress and whatever, there's no, I mean, they can't pass anything. You can't even oust a Speaker of the House and agree to put a Speaker of the House when you have a majority.
Yeah.
I mean, it is just an absolute mess.
Yep.
And I think a lot goes back to when you watch and you see clips from sessions of Congress and you hear what people are saying in interviews and the language they're using, and everything is like they're inferring something. There's like a, not just a negative tone, but often a very, I would say, condemning tone. Like when someone's interviewing from the, Congress, like you can just tell the way they're asking a question is, they're not really trying to get an answer. They're trying to make a point through their question.
Yeah.
And it's like, no wonder we can't get anywhere.
Yeah.
And so I think what we're saying, even probably on a personal level, how can each of us, and I'm just maybe trying to summarize for myself, if that's helpful at the table, how can I have an engaging conversation with someone who might think differently about a topic without using the kind of language that just shuts down the conversation?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Would you agree that that's kind of like that's the
That's
basic
good.
thing that we're talking about?
Yeah.
And I think you have to first remove the identity politics out of the language that we use.
Yeah, you can't have once you're echo chambered and you begin to view us versus them, like anybody that disagrees with you, as the enemy, you become intellectually compromised.
Yeah.
And you're not able to think critically. And so part of it is, how do you remove yourself and begin to treat ideas as something you don't possess? I heard somebody the other day talk about they knew somebody who was just a really dogmatic preacher, and their son for the longest time just rebelled and ran from God. And eventually, and this person didn't realize that the dogmatism and the legalism and the judgmentalism is what really drove their son away, because their son was more free-spirited, artistic, creative. And so this person finally talked to this old pastor when the son kind of had to turn around, gave his life to Jesus. And the pastor, still kind of clueless, told this person that had actually mentor him, said, well, did you see? My son finally gave his life to Jesus. I tried to tell him all his life, and I was right.
Yeah.
And the person told him, said, no, you aren't right. Jesus is right. And that sounds so simple, but I think like we get this emotional attachment to where if our ideas are attacked, we're attacked.
Yeah.
And so I think part of it, what you're saying, is so brilliant. There's got to be a greater value for truth than for ego.
Yeah.
And that can only happen when we disassociate from ego. I think another big thing too, honestly, this sounds so simple, is to just be honest about the issue.
Yeah.
It's hard to talk about without dancing around it, but that's why when I talk about the pro-life, pro-choice, is like, if you think, whatever side you're on, let's say you don't think that women's rights matter at all. Let's say you think babies don't matter at all. Well, just be honest about it. But don't use dishonest language.
Yeah.
Don't say this is just about the reproductive health of women. Yeah. Again, this is where the more, because I had to like wrestle through this concept, and last night, here's the thought I came to. The power of persuasion is amazing as long as I'm being honest. The moment I'm not being honest, it goes from an art of persuasion to an art of deception.
Yeah.
Because I'm camouflaging the real issues. And so part of this, we talked about this too, but this even goes back to, I had a conversation recently. I told you all, I've been watching, kind of observing this the last few years. When someone says, man, that person's just really telling it how it is and saying what they think. On one hand, and then on the other hand, the person that says that person's just getting way too political. I've watched this for about 3 years now, and I've come to the conclusion that really what only matters is whether that person is agreeing with what that person already thinks.
Yeah.
Because I've watched this, and I'm sure I'm guilty of it too. But I've noticed that if a celebrity says something political, then if you agree with them, you're happy they're just telling it like it is.
Yeah. Or a pastor.
Yes.
Yeah,
Or a
that's
pastor.
yeah.
If you disagree with them, they're just being too political and they need to stay in their lane.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
But I just wonder how many of us are actually honest enough to see that. Do we see that, or are we so biased? Are we so tribalistic in our own camps
Yeah.
that we're not seeing it? So I think part of it is just being honest and saying, where are my blind spots?
Yeah.
Where am I emotionally attached? Where am I, if the moment the other person that you're talking to says something culturally, current event, societally, politically that you disagree with, and instead of listening to them, I already have in my mind the response that's been primed in me
Yeah.
of how they're wrong, then I'm not listening.
Yeah.
And it's hard for me to come from an honest place. So I think, just in my mind, some of what's popping in is what you said of how do I detach it from my identity, number one. Number two, how can I just have a radical commitment to be honest to myself?
Yeah.
Well, what do I actually believe about this and why?
And then I think probably the third thing that I would add would be just how do I ask yourself, how do I have empathy for the person that I'm sitting across from? Because I think it is so easy to put yourself in a me versus them mindset. And I think the minute you do that, it's easy to dehumanize the person that you're sitting across the table from, or who you're trying to have a conversation with. And I think that the minute you do that's when you even lose the ability to think through what they're saying and to even process, okay, I hear what they're saying, but what's the idea behind what they're saying?
Yes.
And weed through that language. And I think it's really easy at times to just to look at people as just they're a walking billboard for whatever issues they're standing for.
Yes.
And I just think, ask yourself, okay, what's going on in their life that maybe makes them so passionate about this issue?
Yeah.
And the minute you start to ask yourself those why questions and begin to put yourself in their shoes, I just think it gives you the ability to elevate your thinking in terms of dealing with even specific people directly in front of you.
Yeah, that's good.
I think one of the things that where I've seen this play out that is kind of a unique situations that is, I'm very careful in these kind of moments, but I've had a few flights. I'm the kind of person that when I'm sitting, you're on full flights and sitting next to people, I'm not going to bug somebody, but I don't shy away from conversations because I enjoy it. My wife will sit next to me and she was just ears in. I don't want to talk to anybody. And I'm the kind of person that's oh, who am I sitting next to? And so I've had a few different flights where I've had some, really, I can think of 3 right now that have just had some fascinating conversations with people that just naturally have turned into talking about everything political, everything that is controversial you can imagine, and they know what I do for a living.
Yeah.
And I've had amazing conversations with people that don't go to church, and why they don't go to church would tell me, to people who kind of do and don't. I mentioned this, I think, on a previous podcast, but just even this summer flying, and I'm end up sitting next to this woman who is she's a lawyer from the state of Florida, and we're flying to Colorado. And we had the most fascinating, fun conversation about everything political you can imagine. I mean, this is in the height of all of the Donald Trump and the Mar-a-Lago and the whole case with documents and all that. This is in the height of all that in the summer. And what I always try to do in those moments. This is what I try to do. Number one, I always try to engage with a person, not to win an argument, but rather to, as you said, kind of like build a bridge. Just how do I get to know this as a person? And I'm always, again, partially it's my faith, partially it's what I do. It always ends up leading to conversations. But here's what I know. This is something I keep in the back of my mind. And I think maybe this would be something that every Christ follower should keep in the back of their mind, whether you work in a church or not. Because I work in a church and my role is a pastor, when people always say, what do you do? Where do you work? You know, and it comes up, it always puts a weight on me to remember that I don't just represent my own voice and opinions, but I represent Christ somehow. I'm representing a church. So when I'm talking to somebody, I remember that. You shouldn't have to be a pastor to feel that way. If you're a follower of Jesus, you should, without that even maybe coming up in conversation, remember I represent someone much bigger than just my own personal perspective and experience. And so because of that, when we get in conversations, I'm telling you, like, it never goes bad. Like, I get in conversations with people that very different. Different. I can tell on some issues, very different politically. And we, like, one guy had...
Aren't those most stimulating conversations?
I love them. I had one conversation with a guy who owned a Chick-fil-A, and we get done with a conversation, and he's giving me free Chick-fil-A gift cards, and he's basically says, we need more pastors like you in this world. And cool. I'm not, like, we disagreed literally, this was right, I was flying, it was right after the Roe v. Wade decision. And we got on the conversation about this. And he did not come from a church background necessarily. He grew up, but wasn't going to church, had a different maybe perspective than I did on some stuff as we're going through. But I was listening and we're going, yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah.
What do you think about this? And just because I was not dogmatic in my approach, because I wasn't there, you know what? It didn't change his mind about any one of necessary maybe of those topics, but it changed his mind about pastors.
Yep. I'm going to make an assumption. I'm going to make an assumption, since you two connected, that neither one of you used the phrase woman oppressor or baby killer. and maybe
No.
you know
No.
we and maybe just as you're speaking, here's maybe the thought that came to me. If the challenge in week one of this kind of trifecta was in faith, be weary of God language.
Yeah.
If part two was in relationships, be weary of psychology language. Maybe in this, when it comes to ideas, be wary of primed language. Like, if you have an idea and you're passionate about it, if you take time to strip away like all the like tribalistic language that shows how right you are, even if you don't ever change your mind about it, if you take a fresh approach with fresh language, it might actually deepen how you feel about it and improve the way that you communicate it to someone else. I mean, you can take this all the way from the extreme of, I heard someone say this, I thought this was a good rule of thumb. Don't ever refer to someone as something they don't refer to themselves as. So in other words, like sometimes you'll hear people say, they're just a freaking socialist. And this person's point was, don't say that unless they refer to themselves as. You can call, if you mean that derogatory, I mean, if you don't, however you feel about socialism, but like Bernie Sanders, it is okay to call Bernie Sanders a socialist because he calls himself a socialist. And so like avoiding accusatory, inflammatory language, but then also just talking about like, even think through like whatever it's about, whether it's immigration or environment or, you know, or women's rights or equality or economy, whatever it is, whatever language you always hear that is kind of a language your base uses, so to speak. What if you like took a week and just thought, okay, what do I really believe about this? I'm going to strip away all the trigger words. And what's the fresh language I could use that actually explains how I really feel about this? And I think we would be surprised when we do that, how it shapens, at times even changes, how we really feel about the issue once we bring human language to an actual issue.
That's a good thought.
No, it's good.
I think that you're pointing out just some things that are really important, I think, for us when we have conversations with people before we even go into them. Have you had a moment to think through? And kind of like what we were messing around with and joking, but we didn't do, but just dissect the problem, dissect the issue without all of the rhetoric that you're so used to hearing. And I agree. I think one of the things that gets in the way of having thoughtful conversations that could change someone's mind is that we do it from a position, rather than just as a person.
Yep.
Like we do it from like, well, I'm a this and you're a that, and it creates walls. And it's just, like I said, it's just amazing how many conversations that I can have with somebody that totally thinks differently, and we may not even come to agree.
Yeah.
But because of the way I approach the conversation, they walk away from it, maybe not with their mind changed about that, but they might have their mind changed about, wow, you're a pastor? And you think like that?
And we
and you talk. We had a real conversation. That was literally what I had. I was again flying with that one person who was a lawyer. And by the time we got done with the conversation, she kind of said almost the same things as the other guy. She said, "Do you know how refreshing this conversation was?" She was like, "Maybe there is hope for the church."
Yeah.
And so I don't think changed her mind. We were just back and forth. And we agreed on a lot of stuff politically. It was just interesting hearing her take on stuff and that. But I actually think a more important thing was accomplished.
Yeah.
Is that maybe she actually could see that, wow, there's a church or there's a pastor, there's people out there like you that just don't fall into a camp and just spit out rhetoric that is not intelligent. They aren't educated. They aren't this. They just use their, same arguments they have forever, and there's no conversation about it.
Yeah.
This is all really good, and you guys have articulated everything that I would agree with and say yes and amen to. I find myself sitting here as I'm listening to both of you talk and asking the question, maybe, how do I think even differently about this conversation that we're having? Because let's be honest, I know the way the three of us think, and we're probably very comfortable, more comfortable maybe than others in terms of operating in a gray space or opening up our minds to engage or that sort of thing. But I do think there are people who view ideas as dogmatic, very like this is either a true idea or a good idea or a bad idea. And if you're in that camp, in my experience in dealing with people who maybe fall into that category, the thought process is, okay, well, this is a good idea and this is right. So therefore, the other idea or thought is wrong. And so I need to address and or like call out. I don't even know if that's what I'm trying to say, but I like in some way, like it's like, no, this is just a bad idea. Like you're just wrong. If someone finds themselves in that boat, what are some ways that they can elevate their thinking or the way that they process and because if that's how you feel, and I just want to acknowledge that there are people who think that way, it would be hard if your core identity was no, like this is right, and I really believe this is wrong. Like that can be a harder.
Are you trying to suggest that I'm just trying to clarify that what does a person do when, let's just say, their friend circle or their work circle or their family circle all seems to believe one way and thinks that anybody who thinks differently is in the wrong camp.
Yes.
And you might live a little bit in the wrong camp.
Maybe.
And am I understand? That's a great question.
Do either of you have any real life applications or examples?
I ignore the conversations with those people. Pastor Russ, what about you? I know because I know some of your,
It depends. I think
you ask a great question.
Reading into the question, I think you're talking more to people that tend towards dogmatism and a dogmatic approach. Am I right?
Yeah. Maybe, but again, I'm trying to actually, I don't want to say defend those people, but I'm saying for people who think that way, like there is like a core conviction that they're right and that their idea is what is.
I'll give you an example that's unrelated to anything that you have been in, but it's one I just had a conversation with someone about. It's the whole difference of when it comes to, again, this is an idea and an ideology, but transgender ideology is the whole idea of the pronoun, the pronoun hospitality versus not. And there are what you're suggesting, at least in this environment.
Okay.
I know that
Yeah.
wasn't what you were bringing up,
No.
but we've talked about this. Is that, and I was talking to another pastor. There are some people that literally it is their conviction
Yeah.
that for them to address someone who's transgender by a different pronoun than what they were born would have represented their birth
Yeah.
identity, maybe, or their,
Yeah.
their sexual identity,
Yeah.
is a lie.
Yeah.
And it's not that they just want to
That's
be jerks.
Perfect example.
There's not they want to be jerks. They're not
Yes.
like I just,
Yes.
it's they have an absolute conviction and it
Correct.
feels morally wrong for them
Yes.
to do it. And so I was talking with another pastor and we got on this subject and he was even bringing up, he's like, no, I've had conversations with people. They're really good people. They're not haters. They're not
Yeah.
this, but they do have a really strong conviction in
Yeah.
that area.
Yeah.
And so you're saying, what is your question in regards to that? Because I think that helps frame it. When I understand like a context like that, it helps me. What are you saying?
So
What are we
I
trying
think we would look at a
saying how
situation
to-
like that, and I'm just going off of something you said. Okay, I'm not going to call someone by something that they wouldn't call themselves. So in that environment,
Yeah.
like, okay,
I see what you're saying.
how would I address them? But my core conviction is this: how do you do what you're asking
Yeah.
our listeners to do to elevate your thinking?
Yeah, so I think when it comes to the transgender issue, my answer is go back to its complicated series and podcast.
I had a feeling you were dancing around this and you weren't going to answer.
I think
It doesn't have to be
from,
that.
from what
that
I think you're
context.
asking, I'll throw out a couple of thoughts that are percolating and we can just popcorn back and forth. I think number one is this. I am actually all about strong conviction. Anybody that knows me, I have very strong convictions. I've given my life for a few decades to convictions that I am willing to live and die for. I'm all about strong convictions. I go back often to G.K. Chesterton, though. Like, it's not arrogant to think you're right. It's just arrogant to be able to unimagine where you might be wrong. And I think a great starting place for any level of impact or intelligence is humility. So I think all of us need to run some litmus tests on ourselves. Again, a lot of what we're saying goes back to like cultural, political. If I view everybody who disagrees with me as the enemy, if I have come to the place where I lack any nuance and I broad brush all Republicans, broad brush all Democrats, broad brush anybody who's not a Christian, broad brush all men, broad brush all white or Latino. Whenever I've done that, I can know that I've compromised my intellectual validity, right? So I think first off is like, how do I run litmus tests on myself, my language, my thinking, my assumptions, my stereotypes? You sent us this thing that I think's great, and I'll have to look at how much it is. But I think it's called, the Grounds?
Ground news.
The ground
Ground.news.
news. And I don't know what the source of it
Yeah, I
is,
don't either.
but basically one of the tools of it is it will literally show you a percentage of where you're getting your news, left or right, and then it'll show you here's where your blind spots are. So I just think no matter what your convictions are, if you aren't regularly exposing yourself to dissenting voices, then your mindset is fossilizing and your ability to adapt and think critically is diminishing. And that doesn't have anything to do with lessening your convictions. I mean, when as somebody one of my deep convictions is who Jesus is. When I spend time
Real
talking,
quick, I agree with you. Not
Yes.
to push back on the moment, but
No, do.
I think that's a big fear for people, though.
Yeah.
People fear the minute that they start engaging with convictions and or ideas that are outside of what their very strong core convictions are, they begin to fear that they're going to compromise those convictions.
Then I would say they don't have very strong convictions. Because the more rooted I've become in who Jesus is, the less fearful I've become of somebody disagreeing with me. If I'm afraid to talk to somebody or read a book or listen to someone or have a conversation with someone who doesn't share the same belief as me, that fear is a giveaway that my belief is actually fragile. And or I have a fear of anything different. Honestly, when you first asked the question a minute ago, the first thought that came to my mind was the Pharisees had really strong convictions and were not open-minded and changed nothing. Jesus had the strongest conviction of any man alive and constantly spent people with time who disagreed with him and constantly asked questions and was seen as open and loving and changed the whole world. And so it kind of goes, I think one thing to go back to if you have really strong convictions is to seek what's your motive. Because if my motive is pride, then I am going to shut away, shun, and just be hostile towards anything or anyone who disagrees with me. If I have strong convictions but my motive is love, then I'm actually going to open myself and run towards that. I'm going to seek to understand. It goes back to if I have strong convictions and my motive is pride and fear, I'll build an island. If I have strong convictions and my motive is love, then I'll build bridges.
Yeah.
And so part of it is, if you have strong convictions, as somebody who has really strong convictions in Jesus, that actually causes me to be ruthless with the language I choose, to be ruthless with the approach that I take, to be ruthless in the best way to build bridges, because I actually do have a strong conviction, and I want to find the best way in love and humility to share that with people.
Really practical question.
Okay.
If someone has a very strong conviction on an issue, but they're still in process of exploring maybe another side or reading things like that, should they just avoid talking about it at all with other people?
Give me an example.
Let's go back to the pronoun.
You don't want to use your example?
example.
I don't know if it was on.
Should someone, if in the transgender pronoun example, should someone not even talk about or address like those things until they've worked it out? How they
You
feel
mean like
about
with
it?
other people?
No.
Yeah.
I think that's how you work things out. I think a big issue is that I really think what creates the camps and the situations that you're talking about is that there are people who are willing to listen to someone who has a different take on that idea, and then there are people who won't. I think that's the difference we're talking about in camps. It's not. It's one person will listen and engage with empathy to try to understand, even if it doesn't change their mind and learn, and then one group won't. And I think that some of the journey of what I know for me that has kind of like really changed my perspective on politics and other things, probably more so in the last 5 years than anything else, has been my willingness to try to listen and learn and understand. It's being on an airplane with somebody who's different, or just conversations with people who have a different view, or being willing to read a book that I would normally never pick up, or because I've been challenged to, hey, I have a very strong assumption that I am right on this, and every time I read or listen or learn, something changes in me. And it doesn't necessarily mean that I've switched a conviction, but something has moved, and what has moved most often may not be the conviction, but it has been my response to people who are different.
Could you say it this way? It hasn't changed your conviction usually, but it's textured your conviction, and it's textured
100%.
your approach.
So if you have a strong feeling on the topic of abortion, okay, and you are pro-life, and you're this, I completely understand that world. It's just something that I've come from in the church world and going up. I totally get that. I have this conviction I hold of pro-life. It's me. But as I have listened to other people and learned about the challenges of whether it's the economic issues and the other things for what they're making an argument for, or the situations of like the friend of a family member that came to you that end up having just this awful experience and situation through a very painful, it hasn't necessarily moved me over here. And I think that's the fear that a lot of people sometimes have.
Yeah.
But what it has done is it's changed the way I'll ever talk about this subject.
Yeah.
It's changed that where I have empathy and I go, I understand why you feel that way.
Yeah.
I may not share it, but I do. And what that has done is it's created a bridge to actually have the relationship, to have a conversation.
Yeah.
That is what changes people's minds eventually.
Yeah.
It is not standing on one side of the aisle and slinging words.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's not what it is.
Yeah. I think part of it too is like, again, it goes back to what is your conviction rooted in? My whole, for me, what changed, kind of what you're asking a long time ago, is when I just got rid of, to the best of my ability, I mean, I'm always searching, okay, where is this in me? But completely got rid of any culture war mentality.
Yeah.
On the topic you just mentioned, I was listening to people even this weekend talk about transgenderism, but with anger. And when I think about people who are struggling in brokenness and sexual identity and gender identity, I think for me, I mean, the question is simply like, are you, like when you listen to yourself, do you sound angry at people or for people? Like, it was really interesting. Over Thanksgiving, me and my parents, we went to my dad's friend's side. And so it was like 25 people there for this Thanksgiving dinner. And I had one of the most fascinating conversations. I met this couple from Australia. It's really interesting, him talking about the political system. He said, I'll tell you what's wrong with America. He said, in Australia, we have 3 legitimate parties. He said, and so you don't have time for this tribalism. He said, do you realize how binary and polarized everybody is here? I was like, oh, you're preaching the choir. And so we started talking about it. And we got
calling for 3 parties for a long time.
Yeah. And we got into some fascinating conversations. And he even brought up transgenderism and had a very fascinating, I'd never thought of it like this before, had a very fascinating insight. He said that if you look back on almost any empire, and I don't know, so if you fact check me on this, on any empire, before they were destroyed, before the empire fell, culturally, societally, there was an erasure of genders. Now, I've never heard of this.
Yeah.
So do I understand, and again, if you're listening to this, you can go back to our It's Complicated series. It's a very textured conversation because I do think there is danger in what we've done to try, in many ways, unhealthily, to psychologically confuse young kids who would not otherwise be confused.
Yeah.
But we also know there are people who legitimately struggle. And if I'm in a culture war, then my quote-unquote conviction is going to make me mad at people and mad at quote-unquote a side that I think is trying to do something. But for me, I try to just consider myself not in a culture war, but in a spiritual war. So, which means I'm going to be postured not to be mad at people, but for people. I don't want to see anybody broken. I don't want to see anybody go through legitimate trauma and depression and the excruciating pain of identity confusion. And so, I mean, I don't know if that answers it, but it kind of goes back to motive. What's my conviction rooted in? Is it rooted in a culture war that I've been primed to be angry about? Or is it really rooted in for me as a follower of Jesus, rooted in a love for people and a faithfulness to what I believe Scripture teaches? And how can I take what Jesus has done in me and to the best of my ability, love people where they are, meet them with truth. Mm-hmm. But if it's compelled by love, it's not going to be fueled by anger.
Mm-hmm. Good.
I don't know if there's more to say. Because we could talk about this forever, and but like even what you're saying, it almost feels like with certain conversations, certain people, it feels like it's not worth the fight.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think I'm kind of the persuasion now that I'm going to pick and choose my battles.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And so if I can have again, there are certain convictions about my faith and other things that I hold very dear. Mm-hmm. And there's other convictions that I have that I have just found that the more I listen and allow somebody else's point of view to not only be said, mm-hmm. but to validate some of the rationale or the reason. Like there's some people you go, listen, you could take the topic that was thrown out earlier, socialism, and just be like, I am so against socialism that I hate all socialists, right? And anybody that mentions anything that is that feels somewhat part of it, you just immediately, balk at it. Okay, I can agree. I'm not a big fan of socialism myself, okay? But if you'll sit and listen and allow someone to at least, and you ask them, why do you feel that way? Mm-hmm. You end up finding out sometimes some people are like, well, I'm just so bothered by how many people in our country literally can't afford to buy food. I'm just so bothered. Mm-hmm. And you find out that, wow, I actually agree with you. I hate that.
Yeah.
And then you find common ground that you go, I agree with you. I don't like that.
Yeah.
I'm just not sure that this is the best solution.
Yes.
And that's when you're beginning to remove identities and get to the core of the issue.
That's good.
That never happens until you first take a posture of listening. And I think some people, I think it's dangerous. I just think it's bad posture to sit on your high horse and think you have it all figured out.
Yeah.
I just think there's an arrogance and a pride that exists in camps, and that's all camps, political camps, faith, non-faith. There's this pride that sits in the camp and goes, I know what's right. I'm right. Everybody else is wrong, and I'm not even going to entertain a conversation and listen to you. And I do agree. I think there is a big percentage of that. It's because you have a lot of people, and it's what they believe is kind of what they have been told to believe, or the camp or the environment they've grown in to believe, or their echo chambers tell them to believe. But if you peel it all the way, they're really afraid that they're what they believe is maybe a little more fragile.
Yeah.
Or they're afraid that it's going to be picked apart.
Yep.
And so I just think that, I think that's one of the things like that you brought up. The three of us at this table, it's part of the reason why we'll have conversations like this, is because we have a different posture, and the fact that we are willing to listen to people who are different, have different views, experiences, perspectives, and show empathy. And I think that there's a lot of people that they don't care, and that's the polarization.
Yeah,
goes back to it.
And I think too, like I was in a setting recently, and I think maybe I get good practice at being in rooms where I'm disagreed with by everybody in the room, because I joke that I feel politically homeless. I feel like a lot of times, I mean, I love that we have us. I think maybe if I didn't have us talk to, I'd go insane, because I feel like maybe I'm insane, because I feel like outside of a few people, usually if I'm in a room, I'm the crazy conservative or I'm the crazy liberal. And so I was in a setting recently where it was obvious everybody at the table disagreed with me, and I was the crazy one. And I was tempted. I was like, But I had a thought. These are with people I love. I had a thought. And this is where it goes back to, you almost have to like assess, like, is it worth it? How do I, and I had a thought, and I literally wrote it in my Evernote for that week. This week, I have the choice to correct or connect.
I like it.
It's good.
And I had to decide. I can, out of pride, try to be the person who corrects, or I can be quiet and listen and ask questions and try to connect with people I love.
Yeah.
It's good.
And sometimes that means just ignoring the conversation.
Yes.
And not saying anything.
Yes.
Which is
Yep.
probably something that three of us have gotten really good at doing.
Yep.
And we send internal text messages to her. I was just at dinner. This is what I heard. And then we'll text back and go, you should have said this. But you definitely would not want to say that. But that just stirs the pot. But that helps us just kind of laugh it off and go, I'm not going to, because it's not worth losing a relationship over it.
Yeah. I think
even if it's not a really deep
if there are
relationship,
any practical handles in just if the desire, if you're watching or listening, and your desire, because I want to keep doing this, is to grow and to critically think through the ideas that you both hear and communicate. So if your goal is you want to actually think clearly and think well, number one. Number two, if there's things you're actually passionate about, like you said, you have convictions, but you want to actually communicate them in a way that might bring change, then I think, number one, be radically honest with yourself. Put all your ideas on the chopping block to be dissected, and start with your own. So I think that's the important part, because we're really good at dissecting the language of people who disagree with us.
Yeah.
But what if, especially going into election season, whatever side, whatever, I don't even care. But over the next year, over the next few weeks, like, take all of your ideas and dissect your language. Like, dissect your ideas. Detach them from your reality. It's okay to be wrong or right. We don't own ideas. But put them on the table and dissect them and be honest about them. A second thing is, and I think it's what we've all said in similar ways, but exposure. I think exposure is the antidote to rigidity, judgmentalism. Expose yourself to ideas. Actually genuinely listen.
It's good.
It's good.
I just have one final question.
Yes.
Before we sign off, because you sign on, now we're signing off. In 2016, did you, Pastor Russ, feel the burn?
The Bernie burn.
Did you feel the burn?
I did not feel the burn. Did you feel the burn?
No, I did not.
I bet you felt the burn.
No, I think you felt the burn.
I have
A
never
little
felt
bit.
the burn.
Okay. I know you? No, it's not even worth asking you.
No.
Okay.
But I do think we need a three-party system.
Yes.
Oh, it would be so great if we
But
could
not
just start
socialism.
over.
I think
Not
of
socialism,
all the
but
assumptions
just-
people can make about the three of us at this table, none of us are socialists.
No.
I cannot stand socialism.
Maybe that could be another fun one. What
I think
should
there's
the-
a version
what
of
should
libertarian
this
that's interesting to me.
Yeah,
mystical third party be?
But there's also parts that I don't like about it. So
It's funny. This just thinking about that Australian couple and the third party thing,
Yeah.
because we all talk about we're like this. It's funny towards the end, like how's fascinating couple. They're literally, and the guy lost like 200 pounds in like a year and a half. Like
That's human.
cycles 50 miles a day. They're getting ready to fly over for some championship or whatever. So we're talking about the most interesting things in life and blah, blah, blah. And then I was like, you guys need to write a book. Like, they tell me all this story. And then my dad's best friend, I didn't even realize he had a copy of my book. He brings over and he's like, you guys should read this book. And they're like, who wrote this? Like, you wrote this book? And I was like, yeah. And she's looking at it and she goes, yeah, you left out. I'm just now realizing a detail of your life you left out. You're a pastor, huh? And I was like, yeah, I don't ever really tell people that. But that even once we'd actually had this nuanced, like interesting
That's what-
conversation, it just led to a whole nother layer
Yeah.
of just,
It's cool.
yeah.
awesome. Good stuff. Hopefully helpful.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Who do you think you're voting for in 2024, Pastor Zach?
I don't know.
Okay.
I'll tell you if you tell me. But let's say it at the same
I
time.
alre- already.
Let's all say it at the same time. Ready?
Okay.
One, two, three.
Russ.
Jesus.
I said Russ. I'll write your name in.
Okay, you're right. My name in.
I'll write your name in.
Honestly, I'm just.
I'm writing a name in at this point.
Yeah, probably the same. I am just excited that on his new podcast tour, about 47% of the nation said they would vote for The Rock if he
That
ran
is funny.
for
His name
president.
keeps coming up a lot.
Yeah.
Rock. I like the Rock.
No, I like The Rock.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. What about you? Who you
Yeah.
voting for?
I said I'm writing you a name.
Oh,
in.
right, my name.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think you do a great job. Write you in.
Thank you.
Don't you have to be a certain age? You're probably there. What is it? 45?
Oh, that's funny.
Is
You
it?
know,
What is it?
No,
40?
it's 38.
No.
38?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You,
my
Oh.
my homeschool history.
you would fit in with the last two.
Well, then 38 works.
Yeah,
Oh, you could.
Yeah, you would.
You can run.
I was just gonna say.
You can run.
Listen, Grandpa Moore.
I
was gonna
can't.
say.
I'm
Hold on.
not old enough to
You-
run. It's
Let me-
clear from our candidate choices. I'm like several decades away from
might
being
be 40.
qualified.
Hold on.
I don't think it's 38.
Hold on.
I think you're making.
I
I
think-
think it's 35 or 40.
If you're a 90-year-old white man, you are eligible.
We are. Yeah. I don't. Yeah. Okay. We can move on.
35.
35. There you go. Yep. You're definitely in it, and you're almost.
I'm almost there.
Woo! We get to vote for you at the next election.
Should we get too spicy?
Yes.
Anyways. Oh.
Okay.
Good.
That's good. Okay. All right. Well, so ends the trilogy of this little mini series, The Power of Language. So let's avoid God language, therapy speak, and prime language, and see how it may make our lives and relationships better. All right. Write us in, as always, podcast@thex.church. And until next time, we'll see them.